After playing about 40 hours of Shadow of the Erdtree, I finally beat all the major bosses, including the final boss, only to come out with some complicated feelings. Actually, my feelings about Elden Ring in general are complicated. I've been a fan of these games ever since Demon's Souls, and it's why I bought a PlayStation 3 in the first place, way back in 2010, and we've come some way since then. A big part of the appeal of these games for me is exploring and piecing together the environment. The combat encounters are important too, for sure, but I feel like it works more in service of adding a certain weight, sense of deliberation, or a degree of urgency in the way you forged ahead. It's all a major part of what informs the atmosphere, and something that FromSoft has been very good at delivering ever since Kingsfield. Furthermore, I've always found it fun to challenge these environments with new characters, experimenting with their equipment choices and limitations, and seeing how this would all inform how I'd navigate around certain enemies and encounters. And Elden Ring still scratches that itch too, or rather it does on the first round, and Shadow of the Erdtree achieves this to an even greater degree. The verticality of the map really made trying to piece everything together feel like more of a puzzle, and figuring out how everything connected together was hugely satisfying. I was even using the telescope a lot while exploring the DLC to examine things from a distance, referencing the map and spending a good chunk of time theorizing possible routes to an area. For me, the exploration was a genuine highlight, even if a lot of areas felt eerily empty, maybe even a little unfinished. And some of the loot distribution left me a little wanting at times. However, I know it's going to feel rather tiresome on the second or third time around, due to all the open world bullshit attached, in which it will feel like I've got to go through a checklist, and then a whole lot of riding around before I can play the game. Anyone who's made a few characters in the base game already probably knows what I'm talking about, in which you've got to go about collecting those smithing bell bearings again, your crystal tears, the necessary cookbooks, your golden seeds, your tools, and so on. Shadow of the Erdtree doubles down on this aspect, and introduces new Skadu Tree fragments, a mechanism that confers a permanent damage bonus and a damage negation buff while you're occupying the DLC areas. It's an interesting experiment that tries to provide a difficulty curve within an endgame environment, regardless of your character level, and provides an incentive to run around and explore. But I soon suspect it will soon become another layer of annoying busy work after doing it more than once. And I can't really say I'm enjoying the idea of having to grab all these fragments again on different characters, just so the bosses become a more bearable experience. Rather, I find the prospect very off-putting, because the location of these fragments are usually poorly telegraphed to the player. When we compare them to the golden seeds, cracked tears, and sacred tears of the base game, that are usually associated with landmarks that are easy to identify. By the time I finished the DLC, my Skadu Tree blessing level was 17, and trying to find the remaining 9 fragments required to hit the maximum level of 20 at this point would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack, because to further exacerbate things, there only exists the exact number of fragments to hit level 20, 50 in all. It is simply just open world, collectathon padding. But speaking of making the bosses more bearable, well, truthfully, there are very few bosses in Elden Ring that I genuinely enjoy or look forward to fighting again in a given playthrough. Which is going to sound really bizarre coming from someone who bothered to beat the game at rune level 1 through nearly 6 New Game Plus cycles, and has 9 other characters on top. And well, the DLC didn't really do much to bolster the ranks for me. Their designs and thematics are all really cool, and they still feel satisfying to overcome. They're certainly intricate and complex with a lot of work put into them, but their movements largely blend together into a slurry of egregiously long attack chains with unnatural rhythms and often abysmal visibility. There's also a rather comical juxtaposition in that the player is still a rather mundane entity rolling through or blocking attacks the same way for the past 15 years, while the bosses have become increasingly bombastic. By the time you hit the second phase of the final boss in Shadow of the Erdtree, it feels like this design direction is breaking at the seams. I can't even get mad at some of these bosses. All I can do is laugh at the absurdity and try and feel out a solution that works for me. I wouldn't even say that most of them are fundamentally bad. Just that I find the current design direction to be rather abrasive. Due to the sheer quantity of bosses across Elden Ring, there's the feeling of knowing that whenever I'll have to fight them again, I'll have to sit through a kind of reacclimation period. Because, yeah, I probably won't be able to recall every single infinitesimal nuance behind their movesets. Which combos have an RNG extension? Which ones depend on proximity, or whether I can simply jump over something or not? And then, after all that, how much am I allowed to commit to a given opening? Well, provided you don't feel tempted to just turn the boss fights into a suggestion with one of the various tools the game provides you with. Perhaps the saving grace here is the fact that these bosses are specifically designed to be a one-and-done spectacle rather than something you fight over and over. But this kind of design philosophy clearly has its own disadvantages when taken to such extremes. I feel as if the more ideal response to beating a boss should be more like, whoa, I wanna do that again, rather than, thank God it's over. Both kinds of encounters can coexist, but I think the former should be more desirable. Though, to make matters worse, even many elite enemies can be more complex and threatening than prior Souls bosses, and also require a similar degree of attentiveness, yet will rarely be as rewarding unless their health bar occupies the bottom of your screen. Now, I'm sure some absolute mad lad is going to do everything at rune level 1 with 0 Scadutree blessings, and then the usual congregation of FromSoft orbiters, who make the discourse surrounding these games utterly fecking insufferable, will gleefully prop up someone else's hard work as proof that the DLC is perfectly balanced, either ignorant or willingly blind towards the hours of commitment such feats take to accomplish, and failing to understand the crux of the issue. The learning process against most of these bosses honestly just kinda sucks a lot of shit, and it's frequently hardly obvious if, how, or when you should evade or handle an attack via other means. Like, I don't mind some trial and error, but Christ. It wouldn't be so bad if it was just some bosses that were like this, but instead it's most of them in the game. The process rarely feels intuitive at all. Even running through the DLC on a character with just 40-bit, in robes, and using a scorpion talisman, I didn't feel as if the damage output was the problem. The possibility of my character being cut down quickly due to careless play was a conscious drawback I made when building him. No, it's that I inherently do not find many of these boss movesets fun. And if From were to take the lazy approach in simply nerfing the damage output to make the bosses more forgiving, it's not actually going to fix what I find the problem to be. They're still going to rub me the wrong way. Though for what it's worth, I could still take more than a couple hits if I stacked enough relevant mitigation, and this is a concept many players don't seem to have a grasp of, judging from some comments I've read online. When I replayed Dark Souls in the past year, everything felt natural. I could sight-read bosses or hear certain cues and usually nail the timings to evade attacks. And if I were to screw up, it was clear how I could adjust for next time. Was it easier? Yeah, no shit. Absolutely. At this point, Dark Souls is a rather easygoing, quaint game. Relaxing, even. It was also a lot more fun. There aren't any bosses in that game where I had to spend runs deciphering what the fuck the boss is actually doing to begin with, or limit test what certain attacks are capable of. Well, there's Bed of Chaos, but every example has exceptions. Regardless, it isn't going out of its way to try and trip me up at what feels like almost every possible opportunity. Demon's Souls gets a lot of flack for having relatively easy, gimmicky bosses, and while that is relatively true, I'd also argue that many of them are a hell of a lot more memorable than yet another flailing spastic. The problem is, From has increasingly leaned into the boss encounters as being the main draw to their games. Yet it's not as if the way players interact with the bosses has gotten fundamentally more deep since Demon's Souls. Yet the bosses have gotten a lot more complex and demanding. If anything, the player has just been given more tools to skip the learning process entirely and be on their way. See, a lot of difficulty complaints surrounding Elden Ring gets hand-waved with mechanisms that undermine the satisfying gameplay that attracted many people to these games in the first place. Now, I'm not going to disparage someone for using summons or cheese strats because I don't tie my ego to a video game. But for me, I don't feel as if I'm engaging with the game when I'm being coerced into simply utilising things that trivialise the core mechanics, require me to significantly alter how I'd play the game, or reduce the boss to a piñata. If you're not engaging with the game's systems in a way you enjoy, why should you feel motivated to play in the first place? And I'm not saying that a certain style of play is more valid than the other, if you're not catching on. In my scenario, I went through the DLC avoiding summons and playing to the strengths of my character. Furthermore, I was playing on New Game Plus at rune level 125 on a pure faith caster. But there were a few instances where I had to completely rethink my approach and instead felt it was better to adopt a melee playstyle. This isn't inherently bad, and I'd likely even revel in this kind of problem solving within a different context. Hell, it's part of what makes rune level 1 fun. But I think it goes back to what I enjoyed about Demons and Dark Souls, in that every encounter felt fair and surmountable with whatever character I threw into it. I felt as if I was given the space to fully express and experience the game through whatever roleplay archetype I had settled upon, without compromise. I didn't need to theory craft or experiment with different sets or loadouts on every other boss. Now, you could argue that Elden Ring shouldn't be shackled by similar expectations as the Souls games, but in that case they probably shouldn't have made it feel like an open world iteration of those games. In Shadow of the Erdtree, I was lucky. My chosen character for the first run proved to be incredibly versatile, and was only further bolstered by the powerful new incantations the DLC offered. But often during the journey I was left wondering how you're feasibly going to tackle X or Y with a different build, without having to make contingencies or some sort of compromise, or just find a means to make the boss as trivial as possible. It's ironic because the one thing I feel Elden Ring surpasses the Souls series in is in its capacity for roleplay. For the first time I filled out every save slot in the game with a unique looking character, each with their own inclinations, strengths and weaknesses, and I had a lot of enjoyment in doing so. There's so many little lore snippets, factions and schools of magic you can style your character around. The process of creating characters and not just more nebulous builds is at its best here, and it really elevated the game a whole lot for me. Even spirit ashes can be used to add more flavour to your character by giving them a fitting companion. However, we live in such a wiki-fueled, metagaming adult environment that most people will just pick the strongest ones and not think too much about it. And I wonder if this in itself may be a revealing symptom of the overall balance problems of the game. I can't say that I haven't also fallen victim to it too. However, I don't think most people actually do a whole lot of role-playing in this action role-playing game to begin with. Perhaps it's hardly a surprise when the bosses are tuned in such a way that the average gamer will simply seek the most convenient means to flatten out any bumps on the road. I don't recall any of the previous games having such a degree of metagaming in regards to just simply tackling the PvE. It feels as if the conversations around the game's encounters has shifted more towards the idea of them being a problem that can be solved, rather than observing the dynamic interplay between the player and the opponent. Regardless, where this character building starts to falter is when you get to your third or fourth save, in which the process largely just feels like riding from A to B, picking up key items and anything else of interest while beating up any bosses you need to along the way. Now, sure, you could just run through enemies in Demons and Dark Souls too, but I never felt the impetus to do so. The process of fighting my way through those areas again was a core part of the enjoyment. The journey itself was a rewarding experience even after the umpteenth time. Elden Ring, on the other hand, may begin to condition you into this mindset of running past everything. Because what else are you going to do when you're once again in an empty field that doesn't have anything useful in it, while any enemies in the way merely present a minor inconvenience and can be simply ridden around? In my case, it ended up bleeding into how I eventually tackled Legacy and side dungeons on repeat playthroughs too. I dread to think how much of my playtime is just riding towards a point of interest while staring at vistas. I gave up doing a rune level 1 New Game Plus 7 run because by the time I got to Godfrey again on New Game Plus 6, I was scratching my head trying to figure out how to make it at all interesting. It's just a glorified boss rush with very, very long, albeit gorgeous loading screens. Elden Ring's open world got a lot of praise on release for allegedly having lots of stuff to do. And it does. But these short-sighted accolades didn't show much consideration on how it might hold up on repeat playthroughs compared to its progenitors, games well known for being highly replayable. And yes, I understand that highlighting this may seem comically contradictory coming from someone who's played through the game more than 15 times. However, consider the following. All the open world has managed to accomplish is encourage me to find ways to engage with the game less. And yet, despite all my misgivings, I still really like Elden Ring. I still really enjoyed Shadow of the Erdtree too. But I can't say I love either of them. Instead, I find myself longing for a time when these games felt a little more grounded, tightly packed, slower paced, and made me want to respect them. Right, and Matthew Matosis was right, and Shadow of the Erdtree is the inevitable conclusion of From Software's game design direction. Well, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. I don't usually speak openly about how I feel about these games because I often feel like it's an exercise in futility, but I guess something about this DLC made me really want to reflect on things. And special thanks to channel members Electrofunk, Aristhel, Bavi, Fenno the Fox, Dragonlord 1472, PL, Lost Quailana, Andros Senpai, Aurelio, Leonaut, Chrono Cruz, Eric Alberto Garcia Godinho, Hakure Illusion, and Hayden Richardson. Yes, I'll even read out the gifted memberships. Your support is truly appreciated. I also stream 3 times a week on this very channel, so feel free to drop by. Or don't. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Take care.